Today we ask the question, is there a warning for Muslims in Acts chapter 7? In question 15 of our series, we examined the Jews' reaction to Jesus' message. And today we will see a very similar reaction to Stephen, a believer in Jesus who had a teaching ministry in Jerusalem. Stephen had been preaching the gospel in the Greek-speaking synagogues, and from there he was seized and dragged in front of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin prided themselves on following the law given to Moses, yet they charged Stephen with blasphemy against Moses and God for following Jesus, believing that Jesus' teachings represented an attack on Judaism and its institutions. They incited the Jews to revolt against Stephen, and they set up false charges against him before the Jewish council. However, both Jesus and Stephen were faithful to the law and the Old Testament prophecy. The Jews were the ones guilty of rejecting Moses' law and his teaching about Jesus. This was most evidenced in their killing of Jesus, whom God sent to save sinners. Stephen preached to his accusers from the Tawrat. He reminded them that Moses had prophesied to their Jewish ancestors that he would not be the last of the prophets, and that their ancestors had repeatedly disobeyed God and his laws. They even practiced idolatry. God had powerfully freed them from Egyptian enslavement, and he graciously provided a visible representation of his presence among them by giving them the tabernacle. Yet they responded by rejecting his law and following an idol. The Israelites had witnessed God's faithfulness, and they had the Tawrat to follow. Moses had warned the Israelites that the Tawrat was their very life. And Stephen refers to the Tawrat as the living oracles, because they were given to Moses by the angel of the Lord. Stephen's point is that their repeated disobedience was much worse because they had the angel of the Lord with them. They rejected all of this. Consequently, God punished them in the wilderness. Friends, we have today far more oracles of God than the ancient Israelites. We have the entire Bible. Therefore, we have much less of an excuse to reject God's word. Listen to what the Injil says about this. Therefore, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. For since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? In Acts chapter 7, Stephen also has a warning for those who reject God's authority. He reminds his Jewish audience that the Israelites' first act of rebellion was their rejection of Moses, God's chosen leader, and idolatry by worshipping the golden calf. Because of this, God turned them over to their sin, and we know that subsequent generations of Israelites worshipped the Canaanite sun god Molech. Eventually, God used their neighbours to kill many of them. The rest were exiled from the land and suffered as slaves in foreign lands. But there was always a faithful remnant who obeyed God even in exile. We see this in the Old Testament accounts of those believers in God who rejected idolatry and trusted in God and his future promise of the Messiah for their salvation. And we also see this in Stephen's final words in Acts chapter 7, because they were a prayer to Jesus, asking him to receive his Spirit and to forgive the Jews stoning him to death. Friends, Stephen's final witness to those stoning him was that he saw Jesus standing at the right hand of God, waiting to receive him into heaven. Today, those of us who are Christians trust only in Jesus' sacrifice on the cross for our salvation. This is because there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. Listen next week when I will share, based on Stephen's sermon, why we can be sure that Jesus is the way to peace with God and what our response to this good news ought to be.